to have you here, Malcolm. A lot of us have probably seen you or known about you for a long time, and I'm especially delighted. We have, I think, 120 high school and college students and teachers and professors here tonight. It's great to have all of you. I know some people are still trickling in. Maybe your next book you can deal with the sensation or the phenomenon of Houston traffic and how to solve it. People will get here soon. But again, like Jahan was saying, you know, at the World Affairs Council, we're covering what's happening in the world, all different figures, you know, involved in it. You know, 2 months ago, it's Speaker Pelosi. This time last year, President Bush. Left or right, Democrat or Republican, it's usually something bad about what's happening in China or Russia, Middle East. So thank you for writing so many interesting and not always optimistic, but challenging and thought-provoking books. And as you note in this book, and you guys will all get the book, this is, it's not directly a part two. It's a revenge of the tipping point. 25 years later, I really appreciate the fact that you mentioned at first you thought about writing a book in line with it, kind of a follow-up to it, but you really felt you needed to challenge yourself. And I think maybe the sign of a true intellectual and someone who's truly self-reflective was to challenge your own views and your own beliefs and maybe what you got wrong then or what you think differently now. Can you talk about the process and the idea of how this book evolved and how you yourself have changed in some of these areas?
Yeah. So can you hear me?
Let's see.
I feel like I'm not. Oh, here we go.
Okay.
There we go. I wrote my first book, The Tipping Point, in 2000 when I was in my mid-30s, and it was my first book, and I was living in New York City, and I was fascinated by this phenomenon that New York had gone from one of the most dangerous cities in the country to one of the safest in what seemed like a blink of an eye. And I ended up, that was the idea that drew me in, and I ended up writing a whole book around that puzzle. 25 years later, I thought, well, it would be fun to kind of do an anniversary edition. And I went back and I thought, my first thought was I would just kind of, you know, update it a little bit. And I realized you can't update something that was done 25 years ago. You know, it's like, I hadn't read it in over the course of, in those 25 years. And it was a profoundly weird experience to go back. It's like looking at your high school yearbook. It's that kind of disconcerting experience. And what was I wearing? Why is my hair like that? What on earth would I, you know, what music was I, you know, it was that kind of thing. So I really did think I needed to redo it. And I also realized that, you know, the subject that fascinated me the first go-round was this idea that the epidemic was a very useful metaphor for describing changes in ideas and behaviors. And in the intervening 25 years, we had two real live epidemics, COVID and the opioid crisis. Yeah. And so it just struck me that there was so much more to say. So that's really why I decided to kind of do a whole new book.
And we can't cover all of your book. You guys are going to really enjoy it. It's fascinating, kind of, you know, thought-provoking, eye-opening, a lot of different things. But just in terms of, you know, this idea of social contagion, social epidemics, you know, that it is a real phenomenon, how something can spread without us knowing it or realizing it. Just could you talk us through the kind of fascinating case of Miami and how in the 1980s it really had kind of a trifecta of huge amounts of drug money coming in, the resulting corruption within the community and law enforcement in particular, and then the Mariel boat lift, 125,000 people, many of them come to a city that's only 300,000 at the time. You talk about what it resulted in Miami, and I suppose it just really shows how fraud at a massive level can take off unexpectedly.
Yeah. Yeah, so I've long had a fascination with Miami because I think Miami is so bizarre. It is just the weirdest American city, and I wanted to kind of, I had this in the back of my mind, and as I was writing the book, I got very interested in this idea that comes from healthcare, which is called small area variation. And small area variation is the observation that when you look at the way that doctors practice across the United States, there are enormous differences from one community to the next that don't follow kind of rational patterns or predictable patterns. That the way you are treated if you have a heart attack by a cardiologist in Buffalo bears very little resemblance to the way you're treated by a cardiologist in Boulder, Colorado. That's the example I use in the book. And this is true of an extraordinary number of medical conditions. And a whole kind of literature has developed in the medical world to try and A, explain this phenomenon, and 2, come to grips with it, because it doesn't make any sense. Doctors all come out of, many of these doctors are going to the same medical schools, they're reading the same journals, they're seeing patients with the same problems, they're using the same drugs and technologies, and yet the way they use them seems to vary dramatically from one place to the next. And I thought this idea was really interesting because it struck me that it clearly is true outside of medicine as well. That the way people behave in Minneapolis is not the same as they behave in Los Angeles. So there's something in the air in Minneapolis that conditions the behavior of people who live there, and that's different from whatever is in the air in LA. Well, so then we get to Miami. And Miami is just weird on so many different respects that I thought it would be fun to kind of devote a chapter to why is Miami so peculiar. And the thing that I chose to highlight was this bizarre fact that if you look at Medicare fraud, so fraud, of all the different kinds of fraud in the United States, by far the biggest and most significant is Medicare fraud. If you want to get into the fraud game, that's where you should go. It's relatively easy to do. I now know how to do it. I spent so much time studying it. I could give you advice if you are looking for a profitable sideline. And so everyone, but if you look at the levels of Medicare fraud across the United States, even though it's super easy to do, in most communities there's very little Medicare fraud. But in Miami, there is an insane amount. So the question is, why is there so much Medicare fraud in Miami? So I decided to tell the story of one of the most legendary Medicare fraudsters in Miami, who was a guy named Philippus Forms, who is like out of a movie. I mean, he looks like Paul Newman, he drives a $1 million Ferrari, and his family ran a whole string of nursing homes in Chicago, and they were upstanding citizens and big deal philanthropists. Then they moved to Miami, and they become insanely corrupt. And he finally the FBI catches up with him, and he gets charged with running one of the biggest Medicare frauds in history, and he has this long drawn-out trial, and at his sentencing hearing, his rabbi shows up, and his rabbi says, when Philip lived in Chicago, he was a fine, upstanding man, and he moved to Miami, and he became a criminal. It's Miami's fault. And I thought the rabbi was right. I think it's Miami's fault. So I decided to write a chapter about what's going on in Miami that would turn an upstanding citizen into a criminal. And the answer is, well, there isn't a definitive answer, but I became fascinated with this theory that was put forth by a guy named Griffin, who wrote a book about Miami called The Year of Dangerous Days, which is all about what happens to Miami in 1980. And in 1980, Miami has 3 catastrophic events that hit the city within the span of a few months. The Mariel boat lift that brings 125,000 Cuban migrants to Miami in the span of a couple months. It has a massive race riot that causes thousands and thousands of white Miamians to leave the city. And it has the sudden explosion of the cocaine trade, the Latin American cocaine trade. And the argument here is that those 3 shocks to the system, any one of those events normally would shake a city to its core. Miami has 3 of those events in the span of a few months. And what it does is it kind of shatters the kind of institutional, the authenticity, the legitimacy of the institutions of Miami. And into that vacuum moves this kind of anything goes culture. And that's what is going, there's a story, I was telling a story in that, there's a famous money launderer in the 80s in Miami who worked for one of the cartels. And every day, he would pull up in front of a bank on Biscayne Boulevard in Miami, pop the trunk, and take out a giant suitcase full of cash. And the guard of the bank would come out and help him move the suitcase full of cash into the bank so that the money could be deposited. Now, think about that for a moment. The bank was not just assisting him in laundering his money, but like publicly assisting him and sending one of their employees out to help lug the suitcase into the bank every morning. Like, they had no illusions about where this came from, clearly, right? So if you live in Miami and you're going to work every day and you see this happening, what message does that send to you about the city you live in, right? And it tells you nobody cares if you want to, cross the line here in Miami. That did not happen in Minneapolis. There were no, money launderers working for cartels unloading giant suitcases full of cash in downtown Minneapolis in 1980, right? That's the difference between those two cultures. And so that's the world that this guy, Philippus Forms, moves into, and he gets caught up in that. Anything goes, and the stories in that chapter are just like, they will singe your eyebrows, what was going on in Miami. By the way, I don't go into this in the book, but Miami is weird on like so many levels. I have a friend who's a real estate developer and in Miami, and she builds luxury condos on the beach. And first of all, let's just pause and reflect on the absolute insanity of building luxury condos on the beach in Miami. First of all, you're building them on sand, right? Two, there's going to be a hurricane, right? So I said to my friend, what are the odds those buildings will survive? Like, we'll be there in 10 years. She goes, yeah, they probably won't be there in 10 years. It's like, did you tell the people who buy them that you don't think it's going to be around? She's like, they're on their own. They're adults. Like, that's what's going on, and like, it's crazy. It's totally insane. But that's like, so that gives you a flavor for what is peculiar about this place. That they're behaving like there's no tomorrow, right?
And maybe that's well, first of all, have you told this story in Miami yet? No.
I'm going to Miami on my book tour.
Okay.
And I will. I think the great thing about Miami, I do enjoy going there, is that it's not that they're ashamed of this side of their character. They celebrate it. And I'm reminded of, some of you in this room are old enough to remember the television show Miami Vice, which was a big deal. And the great thing about Miami Vice, of course, is that it's a story about two cops who are interested in cracking down on corruption in the city of Miami. And the two cops, Crockett and Tubbs, drive Lamborghinis and wear Armani suits. So, without explanation. Like, I don't know. As a viewer, I was always like quite taken aback by the notion that somehow police officers in the city of Miami were able to afford cars that bankers and lawyers and, real estate tycoons in other cities could not. But that's the way they were. That's what Miami's all about.
And maybe just follow up to it. You're talking about an over-the-top money launderer. You're talking about in the book people who doctors writing tons of prescriptions or pill mills. Mm-hmm. But like you're mentioning, this is a money launderer every single day going to multiple banks. He might switch the bank, but wads full of cash, millions of dollars of cash. The banks turn a blind eye. At an institutional level, is that the hardest part? You also, towards the end of the chapter, discuss Columbia HCA, one of the largest healthcare companies in the country. 5 of their senior officers come under indictment. They're fined, the biggest fine at the time, almost $2 billion. Their CEO has to retire, but what does he become?
The CEO becomes first the governor of Florida, and then the junior senator from Florida. You may be familiar with Rick Scott.
Yes.
He was the head of a company engaged in the biggest Medicare fraud in American history. And what happened to him? Florida embraced him as their own.
And two of the obviously probably most difficult chapters to read, kind of the saddest and the most tragic, we'll get to the opioid crisis at the end, a horrific aspect of the last many years in the United States, but especially in light of so many students here today and parents as well, those who have teenage age kids. You have a chapter on the unexpected downsides of kind of parents being overly ambitious, pushing their kids to achieve, and even when they do great things, great in school, great in sports and arts, and maybe getting into great schools, but the really, really tragic, horrific downside of this monoculture that's created. In the book, you call it Poplar Grove, and Poplar Grove, I think, out of respect maybe for the real tragedy that happened there, you're not saying where it is, but it could be a community all across the country, many different places. Can you talk about that kind of horrific aspect of kind of excessive expectations and a monoculture that doesn't know how to turn itself off?
Yeah, when I was reporting my book, I ran across a series of papers by two sociologists, and they were all about a town that they call Poplar Grove. They wouldn't identify what it was, what its real name was. Although I figured it out and went there. But Poplar Grove was a perfect community, is a perfect community. If any of you went there, you would say, oh my God, I want to live here. I mean, it's incredibly beautiful. It's close-knit. The houses are gorgeous. The streets are kind of these windy, oak-lined. It's on the water, so these beautiful beaches and public amenities. The high school is one of the best in the state. I mean, it's just like, people don't leave it because they love it so much. If you go off to college, you come back and, buy a house in Poplar Grove. But over the last 10 years, they have had a suicide epidemic at their high school that is out of control. And it's not kind of kids who are alienated and depressed who are taking their own lives. It is kids who seem to have everything going for them. And the question is why? Why would a place that seems perfect have this affliction, this terrible affliction, problem with its kids at the high school? And the conclusion of these two sociologists who studied this place, who spent years there talking to people, their names were Anna Muller and Seth Arberton, their conclusion was that fundamentally the problem with Poplar Grove, as they called it, was that it was a monoculture, that it was a place where there was only one identity available to the kids who went to that high school. So if you think about, when I think about my high school, and I'm sure your high school is very similar, my high school was a place that had multiple kind of identities available to any student who went there. There were the jocks, sounds like a bad 80s movie, but it's the way our high schools were.
John Hughes is
it's like a Johnny. There were jocks, there were the computer nerds in the computer club, there were the kids, who wore tights and were in the drama society. There were the nerdy kids, there were the stoners, it was the goths who were into Dungeons and Dragons. They were I could identify probably a dozen different social groups. And what that meant was that it didn't matter who you were or what you were like, when you first showed up at my high school as a freshman, you could find a social group where you felt you belonged, right? It was a home for everyone. In Poplar Grove, they only had one social group, and that social group was a group whose values were that you were a successful athlete, that you were incredibly popular, and that you were headed for an Ivy League school. And if you didn't measure up to that standard, if you couldn't fit in that group, there was nowhere for you to go, right? And that monoculture was created by the parents of Poplar Grove, and they thought they were doing their kids a favor. They thought what they were doing was creating a high standard that would give a clear pathway for the kids to succeed. What they were actually doing was creating a perilous situation where if kids couldn't meet that expectation, they would feel like failures. And so the word we use to describe a world where there is only one pathway is a monoculture. And they had created a monoculture. And the thing about monocultures is that they are incredibly susceptible to epidemics. An epidemic, if everyone in this room was identical twin, if all of our DNA was exactly the same in this room, if I got terribly sick with a strain of the flu, you would all get terribly sick with a strain of the flu, and the flu would pass through this room like that. We just go, right? There would be no obstacle, no genetic obstacle that would stop the passage of that virus. Well, the same thing is true in a high school where absolutely every kid is conforming to the same set of values, right? A contagious thing like a suicide epidemic will race through the school unabated. And that is what Poplar Grove has been dealing with for the last 10 years. And it is, what's tragic about it, and if you read the chapter you'll see, is that the community seems largely unaware of why they have been visited by this affliction. And that is something that I find kind of heartbreaking and baffling.
And I know you're experts. You mentioned the first two were sociologists. You're not a psychologist or a psychiatrist. Yeah, for me it was heartbreaking too when you say, we know the best answer to a monoculture is to break it up, but you mentioned this high school is largely doing the same things, which probably means the parents are doing the same things. You didn't get into it in the book, but from others, have you learned or anything that maybe could be done or what should be done to kind of address this, or maybe make students themselves more aware of what the threat is?
Yeah.
What is? I know you're not an expert on it, but any ideas?
Well, I mean, it's very difficult. I mean, what I'm about to say is something that has been said many, many times by people far more expert than I am. But it seems to be pretty clear that we have turned childhood from something that used to be the fun, carefree time of your life to a drag, to a high pressure, I don't want to say miserable, but when I look at teenagers today, they are not having nearly as much fun as I had when I was a teenager.
I had a good time too.
Yeah, my high school years were so, I understand I went to high school in rural Canada, so the stakes were a lot lower than contemporary Houston, but I never had homework. The whole idea of homework is like so baffling to me. I didn't even take books home. When school was over at whatever it was, 4 o'clock, I was done. And I just went home and, I don't know, hung out, went to track practice, played with my friends, hung out with my parents, went to bed at like 9 o'clock and got 9 hours of sleep. I mean, that was my high school year. There were no traumas. I didn't know anyone who had a mental health crisis. It's just a totally different experience. And what's weird about this is that if you are a high school student today, you're probably going to live to 100, right? Your lifespan is way longer than my lifespan. I'll be gone by 80. You guys are going to live, people in this room, you're going to live another at least minimum 20 more years than I am, maybe even more, right? So why, if the lifespan is going to increase as dramatically as we believe it's going to be, why are we in such a hurry to burden teenagers with more and more things at earlier and earlier ages, right? You're going to be working till you're 80. So like, why do we care so much about what you're doing when you're 15? It should be all bets should be off until you're 20, as far as I'm concerned. So I find it the whole kind of acceleration of adulthood that's gone on right now. Another hobby horse of mine, but a really good illustration of this and the best symbol of how nuts we've become on this issue is what's happened with sports. The kind of pre-professionalization of youth sports. There's a really brilliant book written by a woman named Linda Flanagan called Taking Back the Game, which is all about what she believes has gone wrong, particularly with girls. She talks a lot about girls' sports, but and she says the idea that there should be traveling squads for 11-year-olds is just completely nuts. And also, one of the things we know by looking at the development of athletes is that that is not the right way to develop an elite athlete. That the correct way to develop an elite athlete is to have a child play a large number of sports for as late as possible in their athletic development. You shouldn't be speeding things up, you should be slowing things down. And yet that is so routinely, that bit of wisdom is so routinely ignored in this, across the country. It's a very weird thing. But anyway, that chapter is all about the consequences of when you increase pressure on young people, you get this.
And maybe in line with the kind of professionalization and kind of extremization of youth sports. A lot of that would come from the type of parents who would be sending their kids to Poplar Grove. You discuss in the book, the magic third, these ideas of tipping points, what's needed, what percentage of women on a board makes it much more effective. Similarly, what percentage of minorities in a community make it a much more vibrant, thriving community. Can you talk about the reverse in line with sports of we had a bit of it a few years ago, the big college scandal of Aunt Becky and rowers who never even rowed before. But can you talk about the role of sports, especially odd, obscure sports that most of us may have even seen, fencing, or kids or women, girls playing rugby at boarding schools, or field hockey, and all these sports that aren't offered at almost any public school. What has that done to the Ivy Leagues, and why is nothing really changing on it?
Yeah, so I have a chapter in the book. Those of you who know my podcast know that I am unhealthily obsessed with beating up on the Ivy League. It's my favorite thing to do. I feel that God put me on earth to just turn the Ivy League into a punching bag. But I cannot turn down any opportunity to make fun of the Ivy League. And I've been doing it now nonstop for years. So when the opportunity occurred to me when writing this book that I could have a chapter that was making fun of Harvard, I leapt at the opportunity. So the thing about Harvard that's weird is, so you know that there's a back door and a front door we all know this. The front door is for 95% of applicants, and that's, you compete on the basis of your test scores and your whatever. It's really hard to get in, and it's the best and the brightest, blah, blah, blah. But they all have a back door, and the back door is for four groups. Legacies, people whose parents went there, which is its own weird thing because I've never really understood the logic of giving a special preference to the kids whose parents went to that same school, because if the school's really fancy, then you've already benefited from your family has benefited from the advantage of going to that school. So if anything, you should be given a penalty upon admission, right? Anyway. So there's that, and then there's the back door is for the children of rich people, right? If you give, the current number I'm told for Harvard is if you give 20 million, they'll get your kid in, which seems low to me. I don't understand why. If you're going to be Harvard, why are you just selling out for a mere 20 million? I'm sure they could get 50. People are like, anyway, it's a separate. And then the third group that gets in the back door is athletes. And if you look, Harvard participates in more D1 sports than any other university in the country. No one's even close. People don't realize this. The most sports-obsessed school in the country is Harvard University. If you thought it was, University of Texas or whatever, no. They're way down. There are more student athletes at Harvard than any other school in the country. And the admissions preference given to recruited athletes at Harvard is massive, right? Now, why do they do that? It's a really interesting question. Why would Harvard have such a massive preference for kids who play sports? And by sports, we're not talking about basketball, football, running, whatever. We're talking about rowing, lacrosse, tennis, fencing, sailing. Sailing's the one that always trips me up. I'm like, so you're on a sailboat, and the skipper's doing a really good job. Do you say, wow, you must have gone to Harvard? Is that like, does Harvard get some kind of benefit by like, why would they care so much about these things? So if you ask the people at Harvard this, why are you guys, first of all, participating? Like in my chapter, I start with the puzzle of why did Harvard a couple of years ago decide to add a women's rugby team? Nobody plays rugby in this country. Like, it's the craziest thing in the world. In order to find players for their team, they had to scour the whole world. They would go on recruiting trips to like Australia and New Zealand to find players, and then give them a massive preference in the admissions program. Why go to all this trouble for what's so special about a rugby player? Well, the answer is, well, what do all those sports I've mentioned have in common? They are sports played by privileged white people, right? Harvard wants to make sure it has enough privileged white people. How do they do that? Well, they have a backdoor for kids who play these exclusive sports, right? I spend a lot of time talking about tennis. Tennis is a good example. If you want to be a recruited D1 tennis player at an exclusive school, you have to have played junior tennis. And to play junior tennis requires that your parents make an annual investment in your tennis game of between, I don't know, 50, I did the math in the book, between 50 and 100 grand a year. Right?
Jeez.
So if you say that I'm setting aside 6 admission slots for tennis players, what you are saying is I am setting aside 6 admission slots for kids whose parents have enough money to spend 100 grand a year on their ground strokes, right? It's really obvious what's going on. It is, to my mind, I find this deeply offensive. You're the greatest university in the world. What are you doing? Like, why would you set up a system that favored a kid who just happens to have a good backhand over a kid who has the potential of being a brilliant scientist it just seems to me crazy that they would have this system and that no one calls them on it. So anyway, I decided to call them on it. That's what I love to do. My other thing, I have many arguments. You know what's also, while I'm at this, what's weird about, there's many things weird about the schools. Why are they so small? So I went to the University of Toronto, which is considered the best school in Canada. Do you know how big the University of Toronto is? 70,000 students.
Wow.
The country's only 35 million,
Wow.
right? So Canada is 1/10 the size of America, and our most prestigious school has 70,000 undergraduates.
Wow.
So if you apply that logic to America, which is 10 times the size, Harvard should have 700,000 students, right? It doesn't. It has 7,000 undergraduates. It's crazy. They got $55 billion in the bank, and they only have 7,000 undergraduates. What are they doing? This is crazy. If you got 55 billion, you should at least have 10 times as many students. At the very least, Harvard should be this. How many students are at the University of Texas?
About, I think, 60,000.
Yeah.
About, yeah.
It should at the very least be the size of the University of Texas.
And just to kind of to close that circle, because some of them, even more ludicrous, might actually get a full scholarship, potentially, or partial scholarship. But is it that Harvard's done the number crunching long enough that we lose 4 years of tuition, but over time that family is going to donate a few $1 million? I mean, is that basically what it comes down to?
The degree to which an extraordinary number of decisions at Harvard are made in order to maximize the size of the endowment is quite astonishing. I mean, they really are a hedge fund that is running college on the side as a recruiting, like a money. You know, if you talk to someone in a hedge fund, they've got a guy. There's the guy who makes the investment decisions, and then there's the guy who goes on the road and raises money, right? There's two sides. Well, Harvard, same thing. They got the person running the money, the hedge fund, and then they have this school which serves as how they recruit their donors. I don't, that's like, it's only a mildly cynical interpretation of what's going on there.
Maybe just one or two more questions, and I'll look at the audience ones.
I could digress on this forever, by the way, Ronan. I have no desire. I have no need to talk about the school and about the book anymore. I'm just happy to talk about what's wrong with elite education in this country.
Is that your next book?
Well, I mean, it should be, shouldn't
Yes.
it, given my extreme level of interest in this. I did a podcast episode on, which I really think is one of the best things we've ever done for my podcast Revisionist History, which was, remember the Varsity Blues investigation, which was all those kids whose parents were getting them into schools by pretending that their kids were athletes and by bribing the coaches, right? Well, there were 56 of those cases, and in each case, the parents pled guilty. They did not go to trial. They just gave up, and they paid fines, went to jail. But then there was a 57th case. And this was a guy who paid $200,000 in a brown paper bag and gave it to the tennis coach at Georgetown to get his daughter accepted as a tennis recruit, even though she wasn't a very good tennis player. And this guy decides he's not going to plead guilty. He's going to fight. Goes to trial, and he wins. And the podcast is all about how he won and why you should be cheering for that guy and not Georgetown. Anyway, I'm delighted with the result. It was this interesting case where I was presented with two potential villains. One is the rich guy who pays a bribe to get his daughter into Georgetown, and the other is Georgetown. Two villains. And I decide that Georgetown's the bigger villain. And so if you listen to the podcast, you'll discover why I believe that to be true.
And the bags of cash, and he wasn't even from Miami, right?
He wasn't even from, although he did have a house. No, I'm sorry. He has a house in Palm Beach, so not Miami,
close.
but Miami adjacent, close enough that he gets a whiff of that anything goes atmosphere.
There are two fascinating chapters in here about the Holocaust and how, I didn't realize it, it's a relatively new phenomenon. I mean, in terms of 40 plus years since the word was used broadly in the United States and beyond. Largely, I won't give too much away, but as a result of television. Similarly, you discuss what seemed like it would take decades more for America to open up the idea of allowing gay marriage. That again, I won't give too much away. It was fascinating how television actually changed that much faster than the advocates themselves expected. You discuss how a lot of times societal change can come much, much faster than people realize. You even quote Lenin, who not long before February 1917, the first wave of the Russian Revolution, he said, "This will not happen in my lifetime. We have to keep struggling. It's not going to happen." Bam! Obviously, we know what happens. Beyond those two phenomena, if television is no longer the force it is now, what do you think can be that societal force to drive change? And number two, are there any topics or issues you think might be able to have a dramatic change in a relatively short period of time for us? Maybe people's rejection of the death penalty, or majority of most people accepting climate change or something like that. You have any kind of ideas of where that might go?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I spend a lot of time in the book talking about the power that television used to have. So, if you go back to as late as the 90s, but really we're talking about the 70s and 80s, it was not impossible for a television show to have half the country as its audience. And I talk about this case of a miniseries that runs in the late 70s called The Holocaust, which plays this extraordinary role in awakening the American public to what happened during the war in the concentration camps in Germany. Believe it or not, and it's very, very hard to appreciate this, people did not know about or talk about the Holocaust until the late 70s. If you look at history textbooks that college freshmen would read for their European history class in the 60s and 50s, there would be 2 sentences on the Holocaust. I mean, it's extraordinary in retrospect. It's ignored by Hollywood with very, very small exceptions. There are vanishingly few novels about it. It doesn't come up in people's... And then there's this a 4-part miniseries that runs on NBC in the late 70s. Some of you may remember this, starring James Woods and a young Meryl Streep. And it's watched by half of the country. And it's like a light bulb goes off. And all of a sudden, after that runs, before that miniseries ran, there was one Holocaust museum in the entire country. And it wasn't called the Holocaust Museum, it was called the LA Martyrs Museum. And it was basically a little storefront in LA on Wilshire Boulevard. And after that show runs, that's when we get the profusion of Holocaust memorials and museums throughout this country. It's really extraordinary. And it happened because of a television show. And it happened because television in that era commanded these extraordinary audiences. It was the vehicle by which society could change its mind about something, could tell itself a new story, that's obviously gone away. No, there's nothing on television can command 50% of the American public anymore. I mean, we've now splintered that audience in 1,000 different pieces. So the question is, what do we do? Is there anything that can take the place of that the television had in the power that it had in the 1970s, up to the 1970s? And the answer is not yet. We've pursued this very different model now, where what we want is choice, and the upside of that is that the quality of what we can see online or on television has never been higher, right? I mean, if you watch television from the 70s, it's dreadful. But so in exchange for getting higher quality programming, we have given up power, right? Television doesn't have the kind of extraordinary social, so that's the trade-off. And the question is, are we happy with that trade-off? And I suspect that at some point the pendulum may shift, and we may go back to wanting more powerful medium and give up on choice and quality. But that's a decision we're going to be making, I think, in the next generation.
There's one or two questions that are. Some people here have already read your book, which is great, and those who haven't, you're really going to enjoy it. If you could address this specific question and then maybe discuss that kind of eye-opening and just kind of really troubling chapter overall. But Leah asks, in bringing publicity to certain high-stakes issues such as Purdue Pharma's intentional malpractice, do you fear for potential repercussions from those that yield great political or social power?
Do I think?
Do you yourself feel? Did you ever feel threatened, or do you feel, I'm taking on this enormous? I know the company is gone, now, but that there's a topic that even is so, I suppose, contentious, or the people at the involved are such powerful people that you yourself might be somewhat intimidated?
I don't think so.
Okay.
I've never been. I think that one of the wonderful things in this country is that we really do have a commitment to free speech, and despite we have moments when we get alarmed over this or that, but fundamentally, this is not a place where anyone should, I think, ever have any legitimate fears about being targeted for what they say.
And then just in relation to that chapter, we wouldn't necessarily go into a summation of it, but for everyone to know, this is about the opioid crisis, the wave of OxyContin. It's really horrific and just disgraceful what was happening in terms of pushing these, reps upon doctors, and only they identifying 1% of doctors who would make 50% of the prescriptions, spending $86 million with McKinsey for consulting just to tell them how to push and sell the drug better. What from the opioid crisis maybe really shocked you the most or surprised you the most?
Well, what's interesting about the opioid crisis is that it follows the pattern that I was talking about earlier, and that it is not a national phenomenon. It strikes some areas of the country far more dramatically than others. And in looking at that variation, so I give the example in the book of Indiana and Illinois, which are side by side, which are in many ways indistinguishable, have very similar economies. Indiana was ravaged by the opioid crisis. Illinois was not. Similarly, Massachusetts was ravaged by the crisis. New York State was not. And I talk in that chapter about why that was so. And I think it's very, very useful for us to understand that there were steps that certain states took that protected them against the worst aspects of this crisis. And it's just a reminder that, the decisions that our policymakers make are consequential. They really make a huge difference. And there were some states that prepared themselves well for the possibility of a highly addictive painkiller being prescribed by doctors, and other states that did not. Texas, by the way, is a state that did. And I just think it's, particularly I know we're in a very political moment right now. It's just useful to remember just how consequential government is. Government really matters, and quality of government really matters.
Two related questions about kind of your kind of writing process. Obviously you're someone with a great intellect, but also an enormous curiosity about the entire world. Lee asks, how'd you go about determining the relative impact of the variables that define the problem? Maybe kind of looking at the variables instead of first, and then studying the problem. And then also related to the kind of the process, Adrian asks, you have an undoubtable talent for seeing and investigating fresh perspectives, and when others don't even think to ask why. What practices or people invigorate your own curiosity?
Well, one of the things you learn. I started my career as a reporter at the Washington Post, and when you begin in that job, my experience was I was filled with terror because I had no ideas. I had no idea what to write about. And then what you learn, I spent 10 years at the Washington Post, and what I learned, it was the most formative experience of my life. What I learned was that the first rule was that everything is interesting, as long as you take the time to learn about it. In other words, the feeling you have that I don't know what to write about, I don't have any ideas, I'm in a panic, is just a function of your own ignorance. You just have to take the time to talk to people and to listen, and you will always find interesting ideas and stories. And that idea that everything is interesting takes years to kind of get through your head. After 10 years at the Washington Post, I had cured myself of that fear that I would never have more ideas. Now I feel like I'm drowning in things that interest me or that I want to talk about. So it's just a kind of, it's really about an expectation about the world. And once you understand that the world is infinitely interesting, you're fine.
All right. A great way to live. You'll never be bored.
Although my mom, when I was a kid, I would always say to my mom that I was bored, and she would always say, "Good. Your mind needs a rest." She still calls me up and tells me her big concern with my kids is that I am doing too many things with them, by which she means that I'm doing anything with them. She thinks that kids should just, wander around by themselves all day long, which is a very refreshing attitude in the present day.
Two questions related to that. So being a father and kind of raising teenagers in the United States as in a broader sense, Leslie asks, how have your opinions changed since becoming a father? And Sears asks, do you think the turn in childhood from a fun time to a drag that you mentioned is a uniquely American phenomenon? And I suppose your perspective on that.
Yeah.
You think it's similar in Canada or other places, or don't know? And yourself as a father, how has it changed your way of looking at it?
Well, before I was a parent, I felt free to give people advice on being a parent. And now that I am a parent, I would never, ever make that mistake again. Because, of course, the thing you learn is that you don't know anything. um, and that every situation is. But the other thing, the beautiful thing about being a parent that I've discovered is that everything that you have gone through with your kids and every observation you've made about your kids has been made by every other parent in the history of parenting. And so it is never the case when you say to another parent, and then my kid did this, that the person you're talking to says, no way. They never say that. What they always say is, oh yeah, that happened with my kid too. And so to be in a world where there is no such thing as an original thought is incredibly liberating. But it's like the first time in my life where I'm under no pressure to be original. I can quite happily just say these platitudes about my kids. And then she spit up. And the other parent will say, of course she did, right? That happened to my kid too. So I really love, that's my favorite thing about being a parent. Are other kids as overstressed as American kids? I mean, the thing about America is that we always take things to greater extremes than anyone else. So I think this is a trend that's happening across the developed world, but I think it's probably more marked in, and also I think it differs where you are in this country. I mean, when I was talking about that town, Poplar Grove is not typical of, it's typical of upper middle class enclaves. And I'm conscious of the fact that we are in an upper middle class enclave right here in Houston. But I don't think it's typical across the whole country. I think that there are very different patterns, cultural patterns in rural areas, in less privileged areas, in, I don't know. So it's the thing that always strikes me when I tell stories like that is the extraordinary variation in this country. It's really, really hard to talk about an American way of doing things because this country includes so many different cultural practices.
Yeah, and I would say probably kids in South Korea or China, sadly, are even more on a mega treadmill than even kids here. And just for the sake of time, a few kind of quick questions to kind of wrap it up. Maybe just two fun ones and then two more kind of involved ones. Richard asks, have you had McDonald's fries lately? And Mark asks, can you still break a 5-minute mile?
Have I had McDonald's? This is a reference to a episode of my podcast I once did called McDonald's Broke My Heart, about the switch that McDonald's made from making their French fries in beef tallow to cooking them in vegetable oil. Now, those of you who are not old enough to remember this, there was a time before McDonald's made this dreadful mistake when McDonald's fries were unbelievable. I mean, the gold standard, where you would say to yourself in the middle of the day, oh my God, I just need to go to McDonald's and have some fries right now. And then what did they do? They screwed it up. They stopped cooking them in beef tallow and they switched to an absolutely inferior way of making a fry. In this episode, I go to this food lab in San Francisco, which is these, like the chief food scientists in the country. And I had them cook 2 batches of fries, one the old way, the kind I remember from my childhood, and one the new way. And there's just no comparison. And if you've never had fries cooked in beef tallow, you have the most wonderful experience awaiting you. And I urge you to run, don't walk, to a place that does fries the right way. The other question is, I'm a runner. I had, as recently as, I'm also quite old, but as recently as my early 50s, I could break a 5-minute mile. As recently as 3 years ago, I ran a 5:15 mile, although I could have run faster. But I'm injured right now. So, and I greatly fear that I'm at a stage in my life where I will be nothing but injured until I die. So, whether I'll be able to run that fast again, when you reach a certain age, it's just a question of lowering your expectations. Every day I lower my expectations just a little bit more. So, my hotel here has a little running path. It's 1 mile long, and I've been injured, and I think I'm better. And I did do 1 mile this afternoon. That went well. So maybe I can get back there.
And the sub 5 minute was on beef tallow fries.
Yes. No, there's this kid, I call him a kid, he's in his 20s, called Chris Chavez, he's a friend of mine, and he and I are always, he's 20-something, and I'm not 20-something. And he always challenges me to races. So that's when, the 5:15 was when Chris and I, you can find it online, by the way, on YouTube. Just put in Gladwell Chavez, and you'll see me running around the track.
Still, very impressive. Maybe just for the sake of time, just two questions. And I will let all of you know your books are, Malcolm already very kindly signed them. You are actually, I've been in council now for 12 years. A lot of your people, you're absolutely the most efficient and effective signer I've ever seen.
Thank you.
So you all, it is kindly, all your books are already signed. I was impressed, almost as fast as you're running. Just one more thing to kind of give us ideas of what to think about. Alan asks, would you tell us about your next book or maybe your next project? And I would also just say, as we often cover what's happening in the world, a lot of military figures in and out of the council, revisionist history, obviously your many books, a lot of people know. Your somewhat more recent podcast on the Medal of Honor is wonderful. Could you just let people know what you want people to get out of that podcast, the Medal of Honor? Mm-hmm. And then maybe, are you able to say your next project?
Yeah, we did this, we had this idea of the Medal of Honor is the highest award that can be given by the military. And in order to win the Medal of Honor, you have to tell your story. Mm-hmm. And properly. I mean, multiple sources, these people put together these kind of dossiers. And so we decided to do a podcast where we just took the most compelling of those stories. And they are, we did what we've done one season, so we're going to do another season. They're so overwhelming and moving, and we wanted to do it because I do think sometimes that we take our military for granted. That we forget that the reason we're all here is that many thousands of young people gave their lives for this country, and in many cases displayed extraordinary bravery in so doing. And so it was out of that motivation that we decided to do this podcast series. And what we discovered is that some of these stories of Medal of Honor winners are they're unbelievable. They're just a reminder of the extraordinary, what human beings are capable of doing when they are properly motivated. And in this case, the motivation was their love of country and their desire to protect all of us. So my next project, I think, is going to be about, it started with the fact that I became fascinated with the former mayor of Los Angeles, Tom Bradley, the first African-American mayor of LA, who served as mayor for 20 years, from 1971 to 73 to 93. And I became convinced that he's one of the most extraordinary and kind of overlooked politicians of the 20th century. But then I got really interested in the fact that he grew up in South Central in LA in the 1930s, and he was part of this kind of remarkable cohort of young black men, which included Jackie Robinson, who's a friend of his growing up. Guys, some of you will know the name Woody Strode, who was a famous actor in Hollywood. Kenny Washington, who in his day was, Kenny Washington, I think his name, who in his day was one of the greatest college athletes ever. A guy named Jimmy LaValle, who was a Princeton, ended up won the silver medal in the 400 meters of the 1936 games and went on to be a chemistry professor at Stanford. And Tom Bradley, who became mayor of LA. They were all young black men from South Central who went to UCLA in the 1930s at a time where there were almost no black people at UCLA. They were all extraordinary athletes. They were all deeply intelligent people. And they were all hilariously, unbelievably handsome. So if you can imagine, if you're black, you can't live in Westwood in the 1930s. You're not allowed. You have to live in South Central. These 5 guys drive every morning from South Central to Westwood, where UCLA is, and they all hang out together. They're walking around campus. They're all like 6'4". People forget how handsome Tom Bradley was. I was interviewing Maxine Waters, who didn't particularly like Tom Bradley, but we're an hour and a half into the interview, and she's talking about him, and she just stops and she said, "Oh, but he was fine." So that was hilarious. But and I got really interested in capturing their world. And what's interesting about those 5 guys is that they were all angry, because you were angry if you were an African American in the 1930s in LA or anywhere in America, right? Because you were mistreated on a level that we have kind of forgotten the extent. And they all dealt with their anger in a different way. They all had different strategies for channeling their anger into some useful, and they all succeeded using these very different strategies. So I want to write a book about the strategies that are available to the angry, right? And using these guys as my kind of, as the narrative that so the route that Jackie Robinson took is totally different than the route that Tom Bradley took. Jackie Robinson, I don't want to give it away, but it's turned into this really, I'm sort of halfway through, but it's turned into this really, really, really interesting kind of meditation on, and I'm not sure what the right strategy is. If you think about it, one strategy is you just pretend you're not angry. One strategy is you express your anger. One strategy is you just you are angry, but you hold it in. And I talk about transmutation is you turn yourself into someone else. But these are all and each one of those strategies has a benefit and a cost. Jackie Robinson was someone who could barely contain his rage. And the story of him in the major leagues is he's always one step away. First black player in the majors, he's always one step away from losing his cool. And he's constantly, and finally, there's a moment in Jackie Robinson's career right at the end where, he suffered. Every day when he played baseball, somebody went after him, called him some name, did something that was demeaning and enraging, and he was under instructions never to respond. And there was finally a moment in his career, which if you read biographies of Jackie Robinson, they're quite extraordinary, but there's a Southern player, white guy, who would needle him and needle him and needle him and needle him, and finally went too far. And Robinson turned around, this was during warm-ups, had a baseball, turned around and drilled it from 20 feet at this guy's head and missed him by a fraction of an inch. If he had hit him, he would have killed him, and he would have spent the rest of his life in jail, right? But he just snapped, right? And you realize in that moment when you read that, oh my God, what that guy was living through on a day-to-day basis. He was bottling it up inside of him, and it was everything he could do to keep that under wraps, right? And you just that's what it meant to be a pioneer in that generation, is you had to put up with an incredible amount, right? And some people could do it and some people couldn't. And those that did do it paid a terrible price for what they did.
And this, I think a good way to kind of wrap it up, and maybe just in light of you mentioning the Medal of Honor podcast, it's excellent. I'm enjoying it. In May, we're going to host an event related to Military Appreciation Week, probably with a Medal of Honor winner or someone a similar kind of courage. I would also say we host presidents, secretaries of defense, secretaries of state, all that. I would say some of the most inspiring people I have had the good fortune and to meet here at the council have been some dissidents from other countries. Last year we had a Tiananmen Square student leader who barely survived the massacre there, seeing dozens of people being killed all around him. got out, worked for years across the world pushing for human rights for Chinese people, went back into China, got arrested, was a political prisoner for many years. Those kind of people are incredibly courageous too. Jahan mentioned Vladimir Kara-Murza, who I look to host again next year. The only person known to have been poisoned twice by nerve agents and lived. Poisoned twice. He's a Russian opposition figure. Poisoned twice, and then when the war in the full-scale invasion of Ukraine started last year, knowing what he was facing, he went back to Russia, joined in the protests, was arrested. He was sentenced for 25 years. That's what we joked about with Navalny, sadly, before Navalny died, that he had a longer sentence than Navalny. I mean, some of those people are incredibly courageous too. And I won't say his last name, but I have a regard for you, Sergio, who asked this question. Sergio is from Venezuela, another country suffering under dictatorship. I don't care if it's from the left or the right. So that's the context of his question. And I know he himself had to leave because of his own threats to his own life and his family. In a context where fear, misinformation, and division are prominent, somewhat like they are in Venezuela, can the archetypes you describe in your book help us catalyze unity and inspire kind of collective action among citizens? What would you recommend to kind of the rational, reasonable middle audience in the United States to how do we come together? How do we get beyond this disinformation? How do we get beyond this polarization?
Well, the thing to remember that when I was talking about the principles of epidemics, one of the signatures of an epidemic is that a very, very small number of people are responsible for moving the epidemic forward. 1% of the population is sufficient in many cases to create an epidemic, and that was certainly true of COVID. COVID was spread by a tiny fraction of the population. Most infected people did not affect other people, but a small number of us produced so much virus as we did. And the thing about division and fake news and all that kind of stuff is that if you look at, there was a really wonderful study I read that looked at this. 80% of fake news is created by 0.1% of users. Toxic posts make up 30% of the online content. They are generated by 3% of users. We're talking about a tiny, tiny fraction of the population that is responsible for creating this kind of discord and division. And I think we need to recognize that what we're seeing when we look online is not a snapshot of our society. Rather, what we're seeing is a tiny, tiny percentage of the population that is masquerading as speaking for all of us. And if we approach it with that perspective, I think we'll be a lot less discouraged.
And how would you say to kind of how can we get that word out there better? I know obviously you have very well-researched, very, thoughtful books and all that sort of stuff, but how do you reach those who, we don't have television being watched by half the country anymore. We don't have this. How does that message, I mean, maybe you're not sure, and we're all not sure. How do you actually get that message out there of kind of media literacy and that sort of thing?
Well, I've written a book, haven't I?
Yes. So, I mean, what would you say? I mean, especially, but especially like I would say we have about 100 high school students, mostly high school students here today. What would just a few words of advice you'd say in terms of multiple sources, know where that media is coming from? What would you say to them?
I mean, spend a little less time online. It's probably a good piece of advice, and a little more time. The world of knowledge that exists outside of your computer or your phone is infinitely greater and more interesting. And so, to the extent that you can spend your time there, you'll be better off.
That's great. Will you all please join me in thanking Malcolm Gladwell? Thank you.